On behalf of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, I'd like to welcome you to this event tonight. My name is Ken Stone, and I'm the treasurer of the Hamilton Coalition. And tonight we're very lucky to have Yves with us. He's going to be delivering a lecture called The Ugly Canadian. It's not about me. It's about our beloved Prime Minister. I have to start off by, we always start off by declaring that this event is being held on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. We are all treaty people, and we call upon the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to honor all the treaties that the Crown has signed with the Native people over the last 250 years, and not just to honor them symbolically in words, but in deeds and with funding. Thank you. Our coalition was formed in 2002 in the run-up to the Anglo-American attack on Iraq. We were first called the November 16th Coalition, but now we changed it many years ago to the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and we've never had to change the name again because there's always been a war. We live in a state of permanent war, and our coalition has opposed each and every one of the wars of the U.S. empire in which the Canadian government has participated. For example, Afghanistan, Haiti, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, and Palestine. So there's no shortage of wars going on right at this very moment. And I would like to refer you, if you're interested in the history of our coalition, to our website, which is hcsw.ca. It's in reconstruction right now, but it's soon we will have all the pictures from going back to 2002 and a complete archive of documents. So I invite you to look at that. We also have a Facebook page, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, a Twitter account, same name, and we also have a radio show called Unusual Sources, which is, we have two co-hosts, Doug Brown and Brendan Stone. And the show is broadcast from McMaster, cfmu.ca, every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m., and you can also get it online at cfmu.ca. By the way, that's sort of a segue to this, which is the fact that Brendan Stone, my son, has been nominated for Best Journalist Politics in the Hamilton Indie Media Awards 2017. And the website where you can vote is right here. If you have internet here, you can vote right now if you like. I also have been nominated in a different category. I've been nominated in the social justice and human rights category, and the voting ends tomorrow. So if you're so inclined, please vote. As for the coalition, we always need new people to join. The executive people come and go, especially students from McMaster. So if you're interested in joining the coalition executive and becoming more involved in anti-war activities in Hamilton, please see me after the meeting. And at the back, we have Sohail near the back. He's got a sign-up sheet for our events list. We only send out notices of events, nothing else, so it won't fill up your inbox. If you haven't already signed and aren't on the email list, please sign and print clearly your email address. Thanks, Sohail. I'd like to recognize a couple of people in the audience. I'd like to recognize Tom Adderton, the Secretary of the Hamilton District Labor Council. Wave, would you give us a little wave? We work closely with the Hamilton District Labor Council on a number of issues, and we're very glad that Tom is here. We also have in attendance Mark Taliano. He's an author. Like me, he's a retired school teacher. Mark, would you stand up? Brendan, would you hold up Mark's book there? Mark is just a little milestone here. That's Mark's book called Voices from Syria. Just printed in English, in hard, in a book. Before that it was an e-book, and now it's been translated into German and Spanish. You can get it as an e-book, or you can get it at our table at the back at the end of the meeting. Yes, Mark?
And this book has an additional chapter, so it's an expanded version of the e-book.
Right. And Mark wrote this book when he was in Syria 1 year ago. Is that right?
Over a period of time I wrote it, based upon that trip.
Yep.
And research.
So please feel free after the meeting to purchase a copy of that. And on the other table are all the books going back many years by Yves Engler. Yves will be selling and signing those. Yes?
Mark's book is $5 and proceeds go to the Coalition to Stop the War.
Thanks, Henry. I would like to extend the thanks of the Coalition to the New Vision United Church for the use of this room. Housekeeping issues, we have water on the table there. Anybody can go over at any moment and help yourself to a glass of water. The washrooms are out the door and to the right. The agenda of this event is that Yves will speak for probably 45-50 minutes. And then after that we will have a Q&A and the copy and the sale and autographing of Yves' books. We should be out of here, we have to be out of here by about 9:30. So I think we should have a good evening here and plenty of time for people to ask questions. The purpose of this meeting, when the Harper government went down to defeat in the October election last year, many Canadians breathed a sigh of relief. After all, Harper had no use for the United Nations or multilateral organizations. He refused to participate in international environmental conferences. He alienated most of the world with his unconditional support for the State of Israel and his love affair with Benjamin Netanyahu. And that unconditional support and that love affair cost Canada a seat on the UN Security Council. Harper broke off diplomatic relations with Iran for no apparent reason. He planned vast new expenditures for the military and planned to create 9 Canadian military bases around the world. He joined in on the bombing of Libya, which has created a state of chaos and anarchy in that country. And he joined in the failed regime change operation in Syria, the end of which we'll hopefully see shortly. He sent trainers. Trainers means Canadian Commandos. JTF, is it, Henry?
Yes.
JTF. He sent trainers. Pardon me?
The Joint Defense Force.
Right.
Now that's Japanese, you're thinking of the Joint Task Force.
Thank you, Sean. He sent trainers to work with the Kurdish separatists in the northern part of Iraq to fight ISIS, and he minimized Canada's efforts at resettling refugees in our own country. He put the Canadian Embassy, its vehicles and its staff at the disposal of neo-fascist demonstrators in the Maidan protests in Kiev in 2014 during the US-inspired coup d'etat in Ukraine. So yes, most Canadians breathed a sigh of relief when the Harper government went down. But since 2015, with the Justin Trudeau government in power, has there been an improvement? Today, we are fortunate in having with us from Montreal, came on the bus, overnight bus last night, all the way from Montreal, Yves Engler, one of the most prolific Canadian authors and writers on the Canadian scene. Yves generally writes 1 book a year, and he's written 9 so far, and then he goes on a long tour of about 30 cities right across the country promoting the book. What's refreshing about Yves, from our point of view, is that he doesn't rely on the accumulated, vetted research by Canadian historians that spout the official line of the Canadian government. He goes to the primary research. He goes to newspaper clippings, he goes to media websites, he goes to government documents, and he also critiques Canadian foreign policy as being based on two foci. One is supporting Canadian extractive industries, mining industries, all over the world. And secondly, on the Canadian government acting as a loyal servant of the empire. First it was the British Empire, and today it's the US Empire. This year, instead of a new book, we congratulate Yves on having a new baby. He has a little baby boy. I guess. But right on his annual schedule, he is right now on tour, and he's lecturing about the ugly Canadian, Justin Trudeau's ugly Canadian foreign policy. He's been dubbed the Canadian version of Noam Chomsky by Georgia Strait, one of the most important voices on the Canadian left today by Briar Patch, in the mold of I.F. Stone by the Globe and Mail, part of that rare but growing group of social critics unafraid to confront Canada's self-satisfied myths by Quill and Quire, ever insightful Rabble, Chomsky-styled iconoclast, Counterpunch, and a leftist gadfly, the Ottawa Citizen. Please give a warm welcome to Yves Engler.
Begrudging compliments are the best. Leftist gadfly. I like that.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to the Hamilton Coalition Stop the War for putting this event on, and thanks everyone for coming out. I got to say that thank you. The Hamilton Coalition Stop the War is really one of the most impressive. I have lots of opportunities to engage with anti-war groups across the country. Unfortunately, many of the anti-war groups across the country are fairly dormant. Hamilton Coalition is really still active, and I really do applaud everyone who's been keeping those hard work up for the past 15 years. Yeah, so I think it really is, for me, a very inspiring, the work that the Hamilton Coalition is doing, and the continuing work. So basically, this is kind of a play off of the book I did in 2012, The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, which was basically a book showing how Stephen Harper had hurt Canada's image globally by pursuing a pro-corporate, pro-military, pro-US empire foreign policy. And unfortunately, 5 years later, I'm here to announce that Brendan, if you could change the slide. That unfortunately now we have it's a nice little easy update for what might be an upcoming book on my part. Save some money on the cover design. So it may be a prettier face to it, but unfortunately the underlying policies of Trudeau's foreign policy, we're 2 years in now, and we have a pretty good sense of where they are. They're not always as bad on every front, but it's overwhelmingly a continuation of the policies that Stephen Harper pursued. Everyone in this room, of course, is aware of the $15 billion light armored vehicle sale that they have signed, the Canadian Commercial Corporation has signed with the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. That's something that the Trudeau government had the ability to get out of, continued on with. It's not just the light armored vehicles, it's also training. A big chunk of that money goes for training. There's Canadian military people involved in some of that training. It's not just light armored vehicles. Just a report I saw a couple days ago, iPolitics, this year, between January and August, Canada's 67% increase in rifle sales to Saudi Arabia. So $11.4 million in Canadian rifle sales to Saudi Arabia in the first 8 months of this year. So this is all new stuff that the Trudeau government is pursuing. So the Trudeau government has pursued a pro-monarchy position, continued the Harper's pro-monarchy position in the Middle East, notably with Saudi Arabia, but with the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies in the region. And Brendan? Oh, sorry. PowerPoint. we don't have the computers back there, so I can't actually do it myself. So he's continued a pro-monarchy policy while Saudi Arabia is. This is Stephen Dion at the Canada Gulf Cooperation Council Dialogue, which is a forum that brings together the foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the monarchies of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait. And this is Stephen Dion continuing on. This is a body set up by the Harper government that the Trudeau government has continued on. Deepen those ties to some of the most regressive, in the case of Saudi Arabia, maybe the most regressive regime in the world, right? A country that's very repressive domestically, that is engaged in incredible violence in Yemen today, engaged in violence in Syria, stoking violence in Syria, and also a major funder of some of the most reactionary Islam around the world, or Wahhabist ideologies around the world. So Saudi Arabia, the Trudeau government has continued that alliance in the region, and you see that policy partly played out in Iraq and Syria, where the Trudeau government did stop the Canadian bombing of Iraq and Syria, which I think is a positive. That was a positive development, but simultaneously tripled the number of Canadian special forces on the ground. A mission that was supposed to be a training mission, and then we find out that the Canadian Special Force Commando is involved in the longest sniper kill the world has ever seen, 3 kilometers away. Kind of hard to mesh training with 3-kilometer sniper kills. We know that there's still continued Canadian intelligence airplanes and refueling airplanes that are supporting the coalition. That it's legal in the case of Iraq, it's illegal in the case of Syria. So Canada's military support in Syria does contravene international law because the Syrian government has not okayed that. So the Trudeau government has been continuing that policy, continuing to support, though we do see in the last couple of days of a little bit of withdrawal of that, support for Kurdish forces that have been accused of ethnic cleansing in parts of Iraq. So the Trudeau government has largely continued that policy, a policy in the Middle East of aligning with the monarchies of the Gulf Cooperation Council, primarily Saudi Arabia, against countries like Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, in Lebanon. And 2 years into the Trudeau government, they haven't restarted diplomatic relations with Iran. So Canada doesn't have any diplomatic relations with Iran. And whatever you want to say about the regime in Iran, it's a much nicer regime than the regime in Saudi Arabia. Canada still has Iran listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. The only other country on that list is Syria. And if you wanted to take seriously the question of state sponsor of terrorism, obviously you would want to look at the US. Also, again, you'd want to look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is responsible for a lot more terrorism in Yemen than Iran is responsible for any terrorism. So the Trudeau government has, to a large extent, continued the Harper policy in the Middle East. No better example of that than in the case of Palestine. If someone at the back could hit the next slide. The Harper government has continued to isolate Canada against world opinion on the question of Palestinian rights. And this is a quote from a couple months ago from Dimitri Lascaris. I'll give people a chance to read. Just basically that there have been number of votes at the UN where basically the whole world upholds Palestinian rights, and Canada again has continued to vote alongside the U.S., alongside alongside Israel, and some of the small little island states, Marshall Islands, Micronesia.
What's the Britannia Island states?
They just follow the U.S. They just follow the U.S. So Trudeau has continued this pro-Israel policy, maybe not as rhetorically loud in their support for whatever Israel does, but still very clearly aligned with it. To the extent that when the Canadian Food Inspection Agency told the LCBO that they shouldn't be labeling wines produced in illegally occupied Palestinian territory as made in Israel, which they clearly weren't by international law standards. They were being made in what's supposed to be the 22% of historic Palestine that's going to be a Palestinian state. When there was a pushback on that, the Trudeau government intervened with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and told them that the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement allows products produced in the occupied West Bank to enter Canada as Israeli products, even though they're being produced on illegally occupied Palestinian land. So we're not even allowed to correctly label wines. The pro-Israel policy is so extreme, we're not even allowed to correctly label wines sold in the LCBO as being made in Palestine when they're when they're being produced by Israeli firms on illegally occupied land. Trudeau himself, the Prime Minister, in May said, "Today, while we celebrate Israel's independence, we also reaffirm our commitment to fight anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism." So here you have our Prime Minister equating the hatred of Jews with the hatred or the opposition to a political ideology that has been about Europeans coming in and taking the indigenous population's land in historic Palestine. You have the Prime Minister just equating opposition to a political ideology that many people around the world, probably hundreds of millions of people around the world, many Jews as well, oppose for very good reasons, with bigotry and whatnot. So Trudeau himself has intervened on this issue, clearly in alignment with the pro-Israel narrative, and has been, as I mentioned earlier, as this quote shows, offside with the rest of the world on this question of Palestinian rights. The Trudeau government's been offside on a number of other issues internationally. One notable one is they refused to attend conference titled "Conference to Negotiate a Legally Binding Instrument to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons Leading Towards Their Total Elimination." It's a bit of a mouthful as a title for a conference, but it's a damn good idea. We should be moving towards eliminating nuclear weapons, and all initiatives moving in that direction should be viewed positively. But the Trudeau government, because our allies, notably down south, have a large nuclear stockpile and have the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons on population, we oppose these efforts internationally, and there's about 2/3 of the world's countries that attended that conference. And I think it's over 50 countries have now signed on to the document that came out of that, and are trying to move that process forward. And our government is opposed to that effort, though simultaneously says they oppose nuclear weapons, right? So we oppose nuclear weapons, but we're not willing to be engaged in any of the efforts to actually get rid of nuclear weapons. It's a hard to understand kind of position. One area that you got to give Trudeau, I think, some positive development on is the question of international climate negotiations. Right? The Harper government was going to those negotiations and doing everything they could to basically blow them up internally, to undermine them internally. The Trudeau government is not doing that. They are not going there and trying to disrupt the negotiations. In fact, they even claim to want stronger targets in terms of reducing the increase in temperature from climate change. So the rhetoric is not bad on this front, some of their rhetoric, but the actual policy doesn't add up, right? You continue to support new pipelines that take heavy carbon emitting tar sands to the BC coast. Even Harper himself, speaking to oil executives in Houston, about 6 months ago, he said, quote, "No country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there." Referring, of course, to the tar sands. But that's precisely what's needed. And anybody takes the science at all seriously, that's what's needed. And it's not just needed, it's important to look at this question from an internationalist perspective. So, okay, first of all, Bill McKibben, the well-known environmentalist, said that, well, if Canada was actually going to extract the tar sands, what's available in Alberta, that would be taking up 1/3 of the world's allocated carbon budget if we want to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, so we're at 0.5% of the world's population, we'd be taking up 1/3 of the carbon budget. Obviously, very unfair. But if you look at the question of climate change more generally, so okay, tar sands oil should stay in the ground because it's heavy carbon emitting, okay, just for strictly ecological. But from equity question as well, this oil should stay in the ground. Canada's a wealthy country, right? Obviously, we're not going to say that Nigeria and Kenya should be first in line to keep the oil in the soil, right? Obviously, it's going to be the countries that are the wealthier countries that have, in the case of Canada's carbon emissions, per capita carbon emissions versus a number of African countries, we're about 1%. They're about 1% per capita emissions that are in Canada. We're emitting per capita 100 times more than many African countries. Not only is there a current imbalance in carbon emissions per capita, there's a historic imbalance that's even more stark than the current imbalance at a 1 to 100 vis-a-vis a number of African countries. So obviously, Canada should be at the forefront of keeping the particularly heavy carbon emitting fuel sources in the Alberta tar sands. That should be, in terms of a global perspective, should be at the front line of what's not extracted. If you take questions of carbon equity or climate change seriously, and it's important to note, and it's not noted enough, is that how much the consequences of climate change are those who are generally least responsible are the ones who are bearing the brunt of climate disturbances already, right? Large swaths of Africa and the Sahel region, places like Bangladesh, very low carbon emitting places, they're already feeling, there's already hundreds of thousands of people dying annually across the African continent from climate disturbances. Those numbers are only expected to grow. And we have to look at these questions. When we talk about building a pipeline to BC to take out tar sands oil, we have to be looking at this from a global perspective, from questions of international equity, quality. And on the African continent, climate change is probably already the number one or among the top killers. But Canada, actually, the Trudeau government's defending the individual, the politician, who's the number one killer of Africans. Oh, I got my slides. One more. So this was the tweet from our High Commissioner in Rwanda in response to Paul Kagame winning 98.63% of the vote. So he did, there was 1.337 Rwandans who were allowed to be opposed to Paul Kagame.
Yeah, I'm sure it's pretty impossible statistically.
So that's a High Commissioner. I guess they didn't, like, the High Commissioner didn't catch on that might be a sign of a not very legitimate election. But Paul Kagame has been our big ally in Rwanda for multiple decades. And I should mention the New Times, which is the only allowed state newspaper, propaganda organ, only allowed paper in the country. Their response to those tweets was to put a New Times headline said, "Heads of state, diplomats laud Kagame's visionary leadership." So they used our High Commissioner's tweets to justify the dictatorship to the Rwandan population. Kagame has been, I think by any serious look at the issue has been has the most blood on his hand of any African leader going back, I guess, almost 25 more years. But he's our ally. So the High Commissioner continues on. This is kind of and no one in the Canadian media mentions this. No one talks about this. But this is open diplomatic support by the High Commissioner that the Trudeau government appointed in favor of the dictatorship in Rwanda. A dictatorship that's not just very repressive domestically, but it's invaded Congo multiple occasions to the point where they, in the mid-90s, they overthrew a government, and then when the government they put in place, they didn't follow what they wanted, then they reinvaded. That war led to, some estimates say, as high as 5 million people killed. Rwanda has continued to control much of eastern Congo. We hear a lot about the instability of eastern Congo. We hear fairly little about the role of Rwanda in that instability, in that violence, and even in more recent time, Rwanda has continued has sort of been destabilizing its neighbor Burundi. So this is a regime in Kigali that the Canadian government backs, even though it's as repressive as any regime in the world, and the Trudeau government has continued that policy in a very sort of embarrassing way. If you could back up one. So this is another area this is a map of Canadian mining investments around the world. And if you look, you can see some of the numbers. Canadian investments in South America, mining companies have more than 50 billion invested. I guess it's too small to see this. But in Mexico, over $20 billion. In Central America, it's over 10 billion, 13 billion. On the African continents, around 25 billion. 5 billion in Oceania, 10 billion or so in Asia. Around the world, in the US, significant amount, in Europe, significant amount. Around the world, Canadian mining companies Canada dominates the international mining sector. Different numbers, but anywhere between 50 and 75% of the world's mining companies are based in this country. Either their offices are based here, or they're listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, Vancouver Stock Exchange, and they're responsible for innumerable number of abuses around the world. Innumerable number of abuses. I did a story about 3 weeks ago, just based upon stories I'd seen in the couple weeks before that, like 3 weeks previous, about 10 different examples I found around different countries around the world of Canadian mining companies in conflict with local communities, destroying water systems, violence, whatnot. So there's just so many examples of abuses by Canadian mining companies around the world. And this is something that the Trudeau government, before the election, promised that we're going to rein in Canada's international mining sector. We're going to bring in something like the Bill C-300, which was a liberal private member's bill back in 2010, which would restrict some public support for Canadian mining companies found to be responsible for significant abuses abroad. Right? Canadian aid agency is not going to support companies found responsible for killing people somewhere. Very reasonable reform. The Export Development Canada will not be providing financial support company responsible for significant abuses. But they haven't done anything. 2 years in, no move on that front. No move on front of legal front of bringing legislation to allow people internationally to hold Canadian companies accountable in Canadian courts. No move on that front. 2 years in, nothing's happened like they promised repeatedly. In fact, it's the opposite. They've basically continued Harper's pro-mining policy to the point where in Tanzania, Barrick Gold subsidiary Acacia, has been a huge conflict, like one of the top political issues taking place in Tanzania over the past 6 months, a year, is questions of Acacia's failure to pay royalties basically taking money out of the country, offshore tax games, whatnot, claiming that they extracted a certain amount of gold and other minerals when in fact it was more. A whole bunch of different basically stealing from the Tanzanian treasury, and a number of government reports showed it's into the billions and billions of dollars that have been illegally extracted out of the country by Acacia from Tanzania. And the new government in Tanzania had basically said, enough, we're going to bring in some restrictions on this, trying to get more of the metals processed domestically. All very reasonable seeming policy moves. And the response, and I should also mention that so Barrick Gold's operations in Tanzania, not only on the question of paying their royalties, paying their taxes, is a controversial question, but additionally, Barrick's North Mara mine, one of their at one point, these 4 mines in the country, there's been at least 65 people killed at the mine by security forces or police paid for by the mining company. Okay, so great deal of violence around the mine already. So it's very controversial, minus the tax and royalty question. It's a very controversial, it's probably one of the most, maybe the most questionable Canadian mining projects anywhere in the world. And certainly Barrick Gold is the most dubious Canadian mining company. They got there in conflicts from Chile to Papua New Guinea, many countries. What's the Trudeau government's High Commissioner's response to the conflict between the Tanzanian government and Acacia in Tanzania? His response is to set up a meeting between the head of Barrick Gold, because at one point Barrick Gold's Acacia's operations in Tanzania were actually shut down, is to set up a meeting between the head of Barrick Gold and the president of Tanzania. After the meeting, the Canada's High Commissioner, Ian Miles, said, quote, that Barrick's committed to, quote, the highest standards of fairness and respect for laws and corporate social responsibility. So here you have the Trudeau government going to bat for Canada's most controversial mining company in the country where they're responsible for the biggest number of abuses, right? This is continuation of, it doesn't matter what these mining companies do, we got your back, this is what our policy is about. Most of what Canadian embassies do around the world is support Canadian companies, and in many countries in Africa, many countries in Latin America, what that really is about is the mining companies. That's where Canada dominates, and that's much of what our diplomats do on a day-to-day basis, is advance the interests in a whole series of different ways of Canadian mining companies, many of which are responsible for significant abuses. And 2 years into the Trudeau government, we have not even seen the slight move to bring in modest reforms that they had committed to before their election. On the military front, so in June they announced a defense policy plan, which plan is to increase military spending by 73% by 2026, to increase the number of Canadian special forces by 605 new special forces. That's the JTF-2 that people were mentioning earlier, Joint Task Force 2, which is highly secretive force. And then the Canadian Special, there's a couple of branches of the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, and to increase their size, and basically they're framed as like a counterterrorism force, but they haven't been basically involved in any counterterrorism in this country. All that the Canadian Special Forces have been used since JTF-2 set up in '93, they have been used all across the globe. And why, politically speaking, why they are popular with politicians, and why there's been this really big increase that began during actually Paul Martin's government, Trudeau, or the Harper expanded, and now Trudeau is further expanding, is that you can deploy them secretly, right? Parliament doesn't know. So they can be involved in I think someone mentioned black op kind of operations. And there's many examples of them being engaged in assassination missions in Afghanistan. That became public information. By a number of counts, they were on the ground in Libya in contravention of international law, in contravention of UN resolutions in 2011. They were there in Haiti in 2004, providing security at the airport that the elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, says he was kidnapped from in the former Yugoslavia in the mid-90s. Obviously, special forces are on the ground in Iraq, possibly in Syria at the moment. So the Trudeau government expand Canadian special forces. Also, part of the plan, the defense policy plan, is to purchase armed drones, right? To give greater capacity for the military to engage in assassinations from on high. To expand the capacities of offensive cyber operations, right? So the communications security establishment, which is its intelligence arm of the Canadian military, very massive institution, over 2,000 employees, that receives way too little attention. They've been involved in offensive cyber operations, potentially taking down countries' electric networks. If Canada's at war with a place or wants to, take down electricity system somewhere, take down computers, all kinds of stuff that's done electronically, which is much of what we do today. So enhancing the Canadian military's offensive capabilities through special forces, through armed drones, offensive cyber operations. That's part of what the defense policy plan announced in June by the Trudeau government. On Russia's border, you have Canada supporting these efforts going back a couple decades of moving NATO closer and closer to Russia's border. More and more, that obviously goes against some of the assurances that were given to Gorbachev back in the early 90s. The Trudeau government has expanded that. So we have 450 Canadian troops in Latvia. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Latvia just a couple of days ago said that those troops may be needed for more than 10 years. Well, I'm guessing Russia's going to be on the border of Latvia for more than 10 years, so I would say 10 years. So hopefully Russia will still be on the border of Latvia in 100 years from now, so maybe Canadian troops should be in Latvia for the next 100 years. Well, maybe 500 years. That I don't think that border is going to end. Russia's always going to be there. So gotta just continue to keep Canadian troops there. You have Canadian fighter jets in Romania, 135 soldiers. I think there's 4 fighter jets there now, plan to get up to 6. A couple hundred Canadian troops in Poland. As part of what they call Operation Reassurance, right? It's about getting troops on Russia's border. It's supposed to be about reassuring the countries of the area. That all sounds nice, except that this is serious stuff. Russia is a powerful country. And this kind of stuff, that the Canadian troops in Latvia are supposed to be what they call a tripwire. If Russia actually wanted to invade, obviously could defeat the NATO troops on Russia's border, some American, some British, Canadian troops on the different countries on Russia's border. But the idea is that because you have all these NATO countries there, then that would provoke a big response from the other NATO countries, i.e. a world war. That's
an excuse for full militarization, in other words.
Yes, exactly. So that's the policy. You can also get Canadian frigate HMCS Charlottetown that's patrolling in the Black Sea as part of this. In the Ukraine, the Trudeau government has renewed the 200 Canadian training soldiers as part of Operation Unifier, which is supposed to be a training mission in Ukraine, which has been associated with training some neo-Nazi forces, right? They're hard right forces that are been integrated into the Ukrainian military, fighting in the east of the country, emboldening those forces, far right forces in the Ukraine, and of course, I'm sure people here have heard about the story about Chrystia Freeland, our foreign minister's grandfather's ties to. She edited a pro-Nazi newspaper. which is in and of itself wouldn't be that big a deal, except that Chrystia Freeland goes on about her great-grandfather, or about her grandfather being very important, portrays him very positively. This kind of policy of supporting sort of far-right neo-Nazi forces in the Ukraine reached a point where what the Harper government did, and then the Trudeau government continued in 2015, where Canada is opposing a UN resolution titled Combating Glorification of Nazism, Neo-Nazism, and Other Practices that Contribute to Fueling Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. The Trudeau government voted against that resolution in 2015 at the UN because it's sponsored by Russia, backed by almost vast majority of countries in the world. The only countries opposing it are the US, Canada, Ukraine, because this was viewed as a Russian effort to portray the Ukrainian government negatively and to undermine, to highlight the neo-Nazi ties of the regime we're backing there in the Ukraine. So the Harper government, or the Trudeau government, has continued the Harper government's policies in that area, and in fact ramped up some of those policies. Now, shifting gears to probably, I think, the last country I'll get into is the question of Venezuela. Chrystia Freeland has taken a very aggressive posture against the government of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. And, there's clearly many mistakes, limitations, problems, things that I would prefer to see differently from the government in Venezuela. But at the end of the day, this is a government, this is a movement that has won 20 of 22 elections since 1998. This is a government and a movement that has made some major social reforms to empower those who have been poor, impoverished for a long time. This is a government that among the governments in the world, and clearly there's at the moment there's many issues that I think most Venezuelans would obviously like to see resolved. There are issues that are serious issues that one can legitimately criticize, and clearly many Venezuelans do legitimately criticize of what the Maduro government and the previous Chavez government did or didn't do. But if you look at this big picture, this is a pro-poor, pro-working class, or anti-imperialist movement that has done a lot in terms of breaking the Caribbean and South America from U.S. domination, and has done a lot in terms of moving that forward in a positive way. And again, that's not to say that everything that's gone on in Venezuela is all great, but the big picture is clearly a very positive movement that has done this all with impeccable electoral democracy credentials. As good as any movement or government, are better than any movement or government in the world, despite a whole host of propaganda in our media. But Chrystia Freeland has decided that this is the sort of one of the top human rights, one of the top democracy concerns there is, and has released into the dozens, I think it now is, of statements or tweets criticizing the Venezuelan government over the past 6 months or so, condemning the government at the Organization of American States, participating in something called the Lima Group of countries opposed, when they weren't successful with getting their opposition to the Maduro government through the Organization of American States. A number of countries, right-wing governments in Latin America and Canada, set up a thing they call a Lima Group to coordinate opposition to the Venezuelan government. Organizing a conference 10 days ago or so in Toronto as part of the Monk conference, alongside the Lima Group meeting in Toronto, to basically build opposition to the Venezuelan government. Now,
Actually called the Monk Conference?
well, the Monk School of Global Affairs sponsored the conference. Now, in 2016, the current president of Brazil, he came to power in a soft coup, right? Temer in Brazil wasn't elected, and it was a soft coup against impeachment process against the elected president. Nothing from our government about democratic problems in Brazil. In Mexico, if you look at human rights questions in Mexico, far worse than the situation in Venezuela. Quiet from our government on that question. And so you have the Trudeau government sanctioning, a few weeks ago now, 40 Venezuelan officials, contrary to the UN Charter, contrary to the OAS Charter, sanctioning and barring, freezing assets in Canada, barring Canadians from having any financial relations. Then you have the Magnitsky Act that they've just brought in, and they're sanctioning, I think, another 15 Venezuelan officials. I think there's one back. Sorry, sanctioning more Venezuelan officials, and then you have this quote from the outgoing Canadian ambassador, Ben Roswell, which I'll give people a second to take a look at.
Not encouraging Canadians to speak out against them, though, are they?
So this is in August in an interview with the Ottawa Citizen, who's Ben Roswell's a real star of Canadian foreign affairs world, Global Affairs Canada. And this is basically openly admitting that we're spending a lot of time trying to build opposition to the Venezuelan government. And this is not something new. This has been going back for a number of years, where the funding of different opposition groups that Canada's been involved with, alongside obviously the U.S. is spearheading that, funding opposition groups, and intervening in Venezuelan affairs in a way that's not acceptable, and are pretty open about it at this point. And so Freeland, in her at the Monk School talk she gave 10 days ago about Venezuela, and about people protesting outside, and actually at the conference, protesters actually disrupted the conference and called for hands off Venezuela. Christian Freeland's response in his interview to a question at this Monk Center, Monk School Global Affairs conference about regime change in Venezuela, her response was, "Canada has never been an imperialist power. It's even almost funny to say that phrase. We've been the colony." Right? That's our foreign minister's response to those saying that Canada's involved in regime change in Venezuela.
No, we just work for all the imperialist powers, apparently.
And so that's I get into the whole history. I wrote a couple pieces that go into responding to Christian Freeland's, but basically it might look like we're involved in regime change in Venezuela, but this is actually just the clean Canada. We're such a pure country internationally. It's an impossibility. Everything we're doing suggests we're engaged in regime change, but this is the pure benevolent Canada. Therefore, it couldn't possibly be illegal regime change that we're seeking in Venezuela. So here we are. We have a Trudeau government 2 years in. Unfortunately, not surprisingly, but unfortunately, we have a Trudeau government that is continuing with the pro-corporate, pro-militarist, pro-US empire policies of the Harper government. And I'm not saying that it's exactly the same. There are some differences, right? If you take something like Iran, the bombastic rhetoric against Iran has subsided, right? That's a positive. Again, like I've mentioned, the UN climate negotiations, at least they're not going there and trying to disrupt those climate negotiations from the inside. That's a positive step, right? Even their some of their carbon pricing plan, relative to Harper, those are positive. Not even close to what's needed, but positive steps. Even on the question of Israel, not there, while still strongly pro-Israel, still aligned against Palestinian rights, not quite as extreme in some of their rhetoric. So there are some positives, but the broad story is this is more of the same. And then you get to yourself, you ask yourself, well, why is it more of the same? Well, I think you obviously start bringing up structural questions in this country. So looking at imbalances of power in our society. You start looking at corporate forces. You start looking at Canada's ties to Washington, to empire. Rather than when Christian Freeland says Canada's been the colony, well, you start looking at some of that history, and in fact, what you see is that Canada has actually been aligned historically with the two main empires. Has been sort of an appendage, as I put it, of the imperial center, with Britain historically, and then now today, Canadian elite are very well tied in to the U.S. elite, and we're very well tied in to the British elite. So when Christian Freeland's referring to Canada as a colony, what do you mean, like compared to Kenya, right? Like Canada was a colony, like Kenya was a colony? No, you understand Canada as a settler, a European settler state that's been tied into the main powers of the world. So there's some big picture structural questions, obviously, but more sort of narrowly. If you could hit the next slide. This is the foreign minister. This is the foreign critic of the NDP. This is Hélène Laverdière last year, and that AIPAC being the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the main pro-Israel lobby group in the U.S. So this is Hélène Laverdière going and speaking paid by AIPAC to go down to Washington to speak at their conference. Obviously, you're not going to get much opposition to Canada's pro-Israel policy from a political party where they're going down to the pro-Israel group and hobnobbing. Hélène Laverdière was also at a Jewish National Fund event in Israel last year. Jewish National Fund being an explicitly racist organization that excludes non-Jews from land they own, which is about 13% of land in Israel. These are policies that were outlawed in this country 60 years ago. Hélène Laverdière is going to their events in Israel. Hélène Laverdière is also, her response on the question of Venezuela is to demand more. Put out press releases in 2016, June 2016, demanding the Liberals undermine the Venezuelan government more, decrying the erosion of democracy in Venezuela, and how Ottawa has to defend democracy in Venezuela. Just a couple days ago, NDP all supported the Magnitsky Act. Right? This is about sanctioning Russia, sanctioning Venezuela. The NDP supported that unanimously, and there may have been some NDP members that skipped the House of Commons vote. So you don't have any opposition on foreign policy from the opposition, or very limited opposition, right? And in the case of Hélène Laverdière, she was a foreign affairs diplomat for more than a decade, right? She won the Foreign Minister's Award for her contribution to Canadian foreign policy. This is somebody who comes right from the foreign affairs establishment in this country, and there's a few policy issues, maybe on something like nuclear disarmament, where Hélène Laverdière, the NDP's position has been critical. But from Venezuela to Israel, Syria to Ukraine, Russia, they basically support the U.S. empire. They basically support what the media says is the perspective to adopt. So there really isn't. It's amazing how little opposition. And even during the NDP leadership race, at the end of the NDP leadership race, I looked at the websites of Charlie Angus, Guy Caron, Jagmeet Singh, and Nikki Ashton, the four candidates, about foreign policy. Not one of the issues or priorities on Charlie Angus, Guy Caron, or Jagmeet Singh's website mentioned foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Nothing. Nikki Ashton, in their issues section, called for a just peace in the Middle East, and then one of 14 priorities was ensure that Canada is a voice for peace in the world. That was all the mention there was on NDP leadership candidates on foreign policy. The only issue where there was actually some sort of okay stuff from the NDP and the NDP leadership race was actually Palestine. Because the Palestinian solidarity groups were engaged in NDP leadership campaign, pushing the candidates to take issues, they did make some statements, put out some tweets that moved the bar fairly significantly on the question of Palestine within the NDP. On the question of NATO, on the question of military spending, stuff, almost nothing. Almost nothing. That's a grim. That's, I mean, that's too, you know, it's a grim situation in terms of the official political discussion in this country. But basically it comes down to the question is that if there's not social movements, if there aren't groups, individuals going and harassing politicians on these issues, you know, confronting them at different public events, organizing meetings like this kind of meeting that are putting forward a counter narrative on Canadian foreign policy, the politicians are just going to go along with the media and go along with the sort of establishment policy. And you see that right down into the NDP. And so there is very little in terms of official opposition. And then you guys, what do we do? What do we do? And there's no easy answer to this. Or in one sense, there's a very easy answer. It's just an answer that nobody wants to hear, which is it's work. We work by building oppositional forces, by like the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. You know, at the end of the day, obviously people need to act smartly, strategically, but mostly what it's about is working hard and long-term commitment and mobilizing and forcing the issues. And the successes are very, very unlikely to be maximalist. Winning a full success is almost, considering how grim the situation is of Canadian foreign policy, the possibility of winning a full success is very limited, but the possibility of having impact is not. And I'm of the strong belief that as grim as many elements of Canadian foreign policy are today, that there's actually been a democratization and a civilizing of Canadian foreign policy if you take a long-term view. If you look at what the Canadian military was prepared to do, let's say in the Boer War in the late 1800s or in Korea in the early 1950s, the violence in which they committed policy was way greater than what the Canadian military is able to do today. And the reason for that is not because the military has decided that they just want to become nicer in how they pursue policy, but it's because of the anti-war movements, because of the international solidarity movements, have civilized the Canadian military. I mean, it's still not a very civilized institution, but it's been civilized versus where it was. So if you take the long-term trajectory, the activism that people have been engaged in on some of these issues have been successful in a certain way. We live in a time that's actually less racist, more internationalist than previous, and that's partly tied to everything from the fighting against the Vietnam War to Central America solidarity to Cuba solidarity to Haiti solidarity to different anti-war groups, anti-nuclear armament movements that have developed internationalist ideology, internationalist thinking. Our problem is we don't have many institutions that uphold those values. In fact, there's almost no institutions that uphold those values. Maybe there's a few media outlets that sort of have adopted, some left-wing media outlets that have sort of adopted some of that internationalist, if you want to call it anti-imperialist thinking, but there's Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is one of the most significant institutions in this country that has adopted that ideology. And unfortunately, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is not a multi-million-dollar institution. It might not even be a multi-thousand-dollar institution. So I think it might be a multi-hundred-dollar institution.
Multi-dozen-dollar institution.
So it's not an easy fight. But these are fights that can be successful, and basically, so it's about building, strengthening these small groups, adding more of them that have been campaigning on some of these international issues. That's the what to do. It's not going to happen overnight, but it can have real. It has and will and can have real impact on making the world a better place. I think I'll leave it at that Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yves, for that excellent diagnosis of Canadian foreign policy. I found it very comprehensive, incisive, and thorough. And I'm sure the audience did as well. What is really sad is that the Canadian government information services and the media have such a stranglehold on the debate in our society that someone who has such a clear vision of what's wrong with Canadian foreign policy is marginalized, like Yves Engler and us here in this room. And so instead of Yves Engler having a professorship at some prestigious university in Canada where he could lecture on Canadian foreign policy every semester, or instead of having a column in the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star, Yves has to go, he has to write book, he has another job. He has to, write at nights and travel around and sell his books to audiences by traveling around on the bus all around this country. So we want to thank you, Yves, for enlightening us about Canadian foreign policy and putting so much personal effort into this endeavor. And we thank you for your complimentary remarks about the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. And we wish you all the best in all your future endeavors. Thanks again.